Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where the clang of the curfew bell sends you scrambling for your doorstep, where a simple rainbow in the sky might land you in the stocks, and where your Sunday afternoon isn't yours to spend lounging, it belongs to the king's archery practice. You're about to discover that medieval Europe wasn't just a tapestry of knights and castles. It was a place stitched together by rules so strange they sound like fever dreams. But here's the twist. Nearly every bizarre law, every head-scratching regulation, every seemingly paranoid ordinance had a reason, a practical life-or-death reason that made perfect sense when you lived in a world without electricity, modern medicine, or fire departments. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or share what time you pressed play. I love hearing from you. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in a cramped, timber-framed house in 14th century London, and outside your shuttered window you hear it, the deep, resonant toll of the church bell cutting through the evening air. That sound isn't calling you to prayer, it's ordering you inside. Curfew. The word itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, and it's not a suggestion. Within minutes the street's empty. Shopkeepers shutter their stalls, tavern-goers drain their mugs, and children are hustled off narrow lanes into smoky cottages. You pull your door closed and slide the heavy wooden bar into place. Outside, the night watch begins their patrol, and anyone caught wandering without a torch and a very good excuse risks a fine, a night in the stocks, or worse. Why this obsession with bedtime? Was medieval society just deeply fond of early nights and rigid schedules? Not quite. The curfew law existed because fire was the single most terrifying threat to any medieval town. Your house, your neighbour's house, the entire block, all of it is wood, thatch, and daub. A single ember escaping a poorly tended hearth could ignite a blaze that would consume dozens of homes in minutes. Historians estimate that major urban fires destroyed entire districts every few decades, and smaller blazes were a near-weekly occurrence in densely packed cities. The Great Fire of London in 1666 might be the famous one, but medieval chronicles are littered with accounts of whole neighbourhoods reduced to ash overnight. So, the curfew bell didn't just send you to bed, it reminded you to bank your cooking fire, to cover your hearth with a metal or ceramic dome, to snuff your candles. Every household was legally required to douse open flames or secure them under supervision. Night watchmen patrolled not just for thieves but for the telltale flicker of unattended firelight through cracks in shutters. If they spotted a glow, they'd pound on your door and demand you extinguish it. In some towns, repeat offenders faced steep fines. The community's survival depended on everyone following the same nightly ritual. But there's another layer to this rule, one that modern people rarely consider. Darkness in the medieval world wasn't just an absence of light, it was a curtain that transformed familiar streets into mazes of danger. No street lamps, no reflective paint on curbs, no emergency services a phone call away. You navigated by memory and moonlight, and if clouds rolled in, you were functionally blind. Criminals knew this. Muggers, cutpurses, and gangs of rowdy apprentices used the cover of night to operate with near impunity. By clearing the streets at dusk, curfew laws made it easier for the night watch to spot suspicious activity. An honest citizen had no reason to be out after the bell. Anyone lurking in the shadows was either up to no good or about to become a victim. Interestingly, curfew rules weren't universal or uniform. Coastal towns with active fishing industries often granted exceptions for sailors and dock workers. During harvest season, rural curfews relaxed to let farmers finish threshing by twilight. And if you were wealthy or well-connected, You could often buy a special license, a kind of medieval hall pass, that let you move freely after dark provided you carried a lantern and could prove your identity to the watch. The rich, as always, found ways to bend the rules that bound everyone else. Historians still argue whether curfews were more about public safety or social control. Some scholars point out that these laws conveniently kept the lower classes off the streets at night, preventing them from gathering, plotting, or simply enjoying themselves outside the surveillance of authorities. Medieval elites worried constantly about uprisings, and a populace locked indoors each evening was a populace that couldn't organize. Others counter that the fire prevention logic alone justified the rules, noting that even wealthy merchants and guild leaders obeyed curfew during periods of high fire risk, like droughts or after a recent blaze. You lie in your narrow bed now, the straw mattress crackling beneath you, and listen to the silence outside. No hum of traffic, no distant sirens, just the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of timbers settling, and perhaps the far-off call of the watchman. 10 o'clock and all's well. It's a strange kind of quiet, one that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. You understand now why the curfew bell felt less like tyranny and more like a lullaby, a nightly promise that your home, your street, your entire world wouldn't burn to cinders while you slept. You step outside the next morning, stretching in the cool dawn air, and notice something that makes you pause. A perfect rainbow arcing across the sky after last night's rain. Your hand starts to rise, your finger ready to point and share the sight with a passing neighbor, but you freeze. Don't point. Never point at a rainbow. The old woman who sells herbs in the market square told you last week about a boy from the next village who pointed at one and his finger withered within a fortnight. Superstition? Maybe. But in medieval Europe, pointing at rainbows was genuinely discouraged, sometimes even punishable, and the reasons tangled together folk belief, religious anxiety, and a surprisingly practical understanding of social harmony. The prohibition against pointing at rainbows appears in dozens of medieval texts, sermons, and local ordinances across England, France, and the Germanic territories. Priests warned from pulpits that rainbows were divine messages, God's covenant with humanity after the flood, a bridge between heaven and earth. To point at one was to point at God himself, an act of staggering disrespect that courted divine retribution. Your finger might rot, your crops might fail, or worse, you might draw heavenly wrath down upon your entire village. In an era when a single bad harvest meant starvation and when disease could wipe out half your neighbors in a season, nobody wanted to be the person who angered God over a careless gesture. But there's more beneath the surface. Medieval people noticed that rainbows appeared during storms, during transitional weather, during moments when the natural world seemed unsettled. They associated them with change, with boundaries between states of being, fitting given that rainbows exist in that liminal space between rain and sunshine, between solid and ethereal. Pointing in medieval gesture language was an act of claiming, of directing attention, of asserting power over something. You pointed at criminals in court, at heretics during accusations, at property you owned. To point at a rainbow was to try to claim or control something divine and untouchable, an act of hubris that violated the natural order. Here's where it gets quirky. Some regions believed that pointing at rainbows could literally break them, causing them to vanish prematurely. If a farmer was relying on the weather patterns signaled by that rainbow's appearance, the end of rain, the promise of sun for his ripening wheat, and you made it disappear with your pointing finger, you'd just sabotaged his livelihood. In communities where everyone's survival was interwoven, where your neighbor's bad luck could cascade into communal disaster, such beliefs served as social glue. The rule discouraged thoughtless actions that might upset the delicate balance of fortune everyone depended on. You wake on Sunday morning to the sound of church bells. Nothing unusual there. But today isn't just about prayer and rest. Today, after the service ends, you'll be heading to the village green with every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 60. You're not going for a picnic or a friendly game. You're going for mandatory archery practice, and if you skip it, the fine will sting almost as much as the blisters you'll earn drawing a longbow for 2 solid hours. This isn't a quirky local tradition. This is English law, enforced with surprising vigour from the reign of Edward III all the way into the Tudor period, and it existed because England's military dominance depended entirely on a populace that could shoot. The statute is blunt and uncompromising. Every male must own a bow and practice regularly. On Sundays and holy days, after church services conclude, archery practice is compulsory. Village constables monitor attendance, and sheriffs audit compliance. But here's the part that makes you groan. To ensure everyone actually shows up and takes it seriously, the same laws explicitly ban alternative recreations. Football? Forbidden. Dice games? Illegal. Bowling? Outlawed. Historians have found dozens of royal proclamations from the 14th and 15th centuries that repeat the same refrain. Stop wasting time on dishonest, vain and useless games, and get to the butts, the archery targets, immediately. Why this obsession with turning the entire male population into archers? Because the English longbow was the medieval equivalent of a superweapon, and unlike crossbows or mounted knights, it required years of training to use effectively. You couldn't hand a peasant a longbow on Monday and expect him to fight on Tuesday. Drawing a war bow, some of which had pull weights exceeding 150 pounds, required specific muscle development, technique and stamina that could only be built through regular, sustained practice starting in childhood. Skeletons of medieval English archers show distinctive bone deformities in their left arms and enlarged left shoulder joints from a lifetime of drawing massive bows. These men were specialists, and England needed thousands of them. The longbow's strategic value became devastatingly clear at battles like Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, where English archers shredded French cavalry and infantry formations with volleys so dense they darkened the sky. French chroniclers described the arrow storms with a mixture of awe and horror, wave after wave of bodkin-tipped shafts punching through armour, felling horses, creating chaos in tightly packed formations. A skilled English archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute with lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 200 yards. But that skill took a decade or more to develop, which meant England couldn't rely on training soldiers only when war broke out. The entire society had to be militarized at a baseline level, ready to mobilize an archer army whenever the king needed one. So the Sunday archery laws weren't really about Sunday at all. They were about national defense disguised as community activity. You stand at the butts now, your bow creaking as you draw, your fingers already aching from the repetition. Around you, men of all ages loose arrows with varying degrees of success. The blacksmith's son, barely 17, hits the center target consistently. He's been doing this since he was tall enough to hold a child's bow. Old Thomas the miller wheezes as he draws, but still manages respectable groupings. Muscle memory built over 40 years compensates for his fading eyesight. The village reeve walks among you, noting who's present, checking that boys are being properly instructed, occasionally barking corrections at someone whose form has gotten sloppy. What about the football ban? That part seems especially cruel from a modern perspective. Medieval football was wildly popular, a chaotic, violent, village-wide brawl that involved hundreds of participants trying to move a pig's bladder ball between landmarks sometimes miles apart. It was also incredibly time-consuming and frequently resulted in injuries that left men unable to work, let alone fight. Edward III's 1363 proclamation banned football explicitly because it was distracting men from archery practice, and frankly, because the Crown viewed it as a waste of military potential. Why risk a broken leg in a game when that leg might be needed to brace against a longbow in battle? Historians still argue whether these laws were actually enforced consistently or if they were more aspirational than practical. Court records show periodic fines for playing illegal games and skipping archery practice, suggesting at least some authorities took enforcement seriously. But regional variation was enormous. In remote northern villages, sheriffs might turn a blind eye as long as a reasonable number of men showed up for occasional practice. In towns near royal estates or military muster points, enforcement was far stricter. The wealthy, predictably, could often buy exemptions or hire substitutes, though even nobles were expected to maintain archery skills as part of their nightly training. There's something oddly communal about this mandatory practice, though. You're standing shoulder to shoulder with men you've known your entire life, the baker, the carpenter, the farmer who shares your field boundary. You're all equally sweaty, equally frustrated when arrows go wide, equally satisfied when they thud home. War might be a distant abstraction most years, but this weekly ritual keeps you connected to something larger than your individual life. England expects you to be ready. Your neighbours expect you to pull your weight. And in a strange way, the repetitive focus of drawing, aiming, and loosing becomes almost meditative, the ache in your shoulders a familiar companion. By the time practice ends, your hands are raw and your back screams. But you've put 60 arrows downrange and at least 20 hit somewhere useful. Next Sunday, you'll do it again. The Sunday after that, again. Year after year, until your body remembers the motion so deeply you could probably do it half asleep. Which, given that you might someday wake to a call to muster and find yourself on a battlefield in France or Scotland, is exactly the point. Exactly the point. You're thirsty after all that archery practice, and fortunately, the village alehouse sits just across the green. You push through the low doorway into the dim, yeasty-smelling interior where a dozen neighbours already cluster around rough wooden tables, nursing leather jacks of ale. The alewife, a sturdy woman named Marjorie who brews in the shed behind her cottage, pours you a measure from a clay jug. You take a long drink, and it's good, slightly sweet, cloudy, nourishing. You trust this ale because you know Marjorie takes her work seriously, and more importantly, because the town's official ale taster certified this batch just yesterday. Yes, your medieval town employs a professional ale taster, and his job is far stranger and more important than you might imagine. The position goes by various names: ale conner, ale taster, ale founder. In many English towns, it's an elected or appointed office that comes with a small salary, considerable respect, and one of the most peculiar quality control methods ever devised. The ale taster's job is to inspect every batch of ale brewed for public sale, ensuring it meets minimum standards for strength, purity, and safety. But here's where it gets wonderfully weird. One traditional testing method involved the ale taster wearing leather breeches, pouring ale onto a wooden bench, sitting in the puddle for a specified period, sometimes as long as half an hour, then attempting to stand. If his leather pants stuck to the bench, the ale had too much sugar and hadn't fermented properly, which meant the brewer had either used too much grain, diluting the alcohol content to stretch her supply, or had stopped fermentation too early. Either way, she'd failed to produce proper ale and faced fines. Why did this matter so desperately? Because ale wasn't just a beverage in medieval England. It was a staple food, a safer alternative to contaminated water, and a source of calories that kept labourers functioning. Adults drank several pints daily. Children drank small ale, with lower alcohol content, and even breakfast often included bread and ale. Water from rivers, wells, and streams frequently carried diseases that medieval people couldn't identify but definitely suffered from. The brewing process, particularly the boiling stage, killed most pathogens, making ale dramatically safer to drink than raw water. A town with bad ale wasn't just inconvenient, it was a public health crisis waiting to happen. The ale taster also watched for more sinister problems. Unscrupulous brewers sometimes added dubious ingredients to stretch their batches or mask poor quality. Chalk, wood ash, bitter herbs that weren't hops, even toxic substances. Contaminated ale could sicken dozens of people, and in the worst cases, deliberate poisoning wasn't unheard of. The ale taster served as both quality inspector and poisoner preventer, a human canary in the coal mine who tested each batch before the general public consumed it. It was a position of trust, and in some towns, ale tasters were required to take oaths before witnesses, swearing to execute their duties faithfully and without bias. Historians still argue whether the sticky breeches test actually worked or if it was more theatre than science. Skeptics point out that sugar content alone wouldn't necessarily create adhesion and that the test seems suspiciously subjective. Defenders note that residual sugars in under-fermented ale would indeed create a tacky surface when combined with the natural oils in leather, and that experienced ale tasters develop genuine expertise in distinguishing good from bad brews. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The test provided a ritualized public demonstration of quality control, and while imperfect, it was backed by the taster's trained palate and knowledge of proper brewing techniques. You watch Marjorie work behind her makeshift bar, and you remember that brewing is overwhelmingly women's work in your village. Alewives, female brewers, dominate the trade, producing ale in their homes as a side income or primary business. The tall, pointed hat Marjorie sometimes wears to market? That's so customers can spot her in crowds when she's selling. The broom propped beside her door? A traditional sign that fresh ale is available. These symbols will, centuries later, become associated with witches, but right now they're simply the professional markers of a respected tradeswoman. The ale taster's job isn't limited to the sticky bench test. He also monitors pricing. Alehouses can't overcharge, especially during grain shortages, and ensures proper measures. That jack you're drinking from should hold a legal pint, not 3/4 of one, and the taster carries reference vessels to check. He inspects brewing equipment for cleanliness, examines grain stores for rot or infestation, and listens to customer complaints. It's part food inspector, part consumer protection agent, part public health officer, all rolled into one frequently drunk official. There's something charmingly democratic about the system. Marjorie might be poor, female, and landless, but if her ale passes inspection, she can sell it legally and earn a living. The ale taster doesn't care about her social status, he cares about her fermentation. Wealthy households brewing for private consumption face the same scrutiny if they sell surplus to neighbours. The rule applies universally, which in a stratified medieval society is surprisingly egalitarian. Good ale is good ale, regardless of who brewed it. You drain your jack and nod to Marjorie for another. Your fellow archers around you are loosening up now, the day's mandatory practice fading into comfortable companionship. Someone tells a joke about the ale taster's sticky breeches. It's an old joke, but it still gets laughs. You think about how much trust flows through this simple transaction. You trust Marjorie's brewing skill. You trust the ale taster's judgment. You trust the town's enforcement of quality standards. In a world without ingredient labels, health departments, or liability lawsuits, this web of personal accountability and public inspection is what keeps you safe. And honestly, the ale tastes pretty damn good. You finish your ale and step back into the afternoon sunlight, squinting as your eyes adjust. A merchant passes you on the street and you know immediately that he's a merchant. not because you recognize his face, but because of what he's wearing. His gown falls to mid-calf, made of fine wool dyed a deep burgundy, and his belt is leather with modest silver fittings, not too fancy, not too plain. Exactly what the law requires for a man of his station. You glance down at your own clothing. Undyed woolen tunic, linen undershift, leather boots that have been resoled twice. This too is precisely what the law allows for someone of your class. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, where what you wear isn't a personal choice, it's a legal obligation, and breaking it can land you in serious trouble. Sumptuary legislation, from the Latin sumptuarius, relating to expense, dictated who could wear what based on social rank, occupation, and income. These laws emerged across medieval Europe, but England's versions were particularly detailed and obsessively enforced. The Statute of 1363, for instance, spelled out exactly which fabrics, colours, furs and ornaments each social tier could use. Knights and their families could wear velvet and silk. Wealthy merchants could wear wool but not ermine. Labourers and farmers, people like you, were restricted to coarse wool and linen, with strict prohibitions on any gold thread, imported fabrics or dyes that cost more than a few pennies per yard. Why this mania for controlling fashion? The surface explanation was moral. Authorities claimed they were preventing pride, vanity, and the sin of aping one's betters. Preachers thundered from pulpits about peasants who dressed above their station, warning that such presumption invited divine punishment and social chaos. But dig deeper, and you find economic anxiety driving these laws. Medieval England's economy depended on everyone knowing their place and staying there. If a wealthy merchant's daughter dressed identically to a baroness, how could you tell them apart? How could the social hierarchy function if visual markers of rank disappeared? The economic concerns were surprisingly sophisticated. England imported expensive fabrics, silk from Italy, fine wool from Flanders, fur from Scandinavia, and authorities worried that excessive demand for luxury goods drained national wealth. By restricting who could purchase these items, sumptuary laws theoretically kept money circulating domestically and prevented the lower classes from bankrupting themselves trying to dress fashionably. There's a genuine paternalism here, mixed with protectionism. The government essentially said, "We'll save you from your own aspirational spending by making it illegal." But there's another layer that historians still argue about: social legibility. In a world without identification documents, credit cards, or databases, your clothing was your ID badge. A quick glance told observers your approximate wealth, your profession, your marital status, sometimes even your hometown. Sumptuary laws preserved this instant visual communication system. When a richly dressed stranger rode into town, everyone immediately deferred appropriately, or watched him suspiciously if his clothing seemed too fine for his behaviour. The system only worked if the signals remained standardised and enforceable. You pass a group of apprentices in the street, all wearing the prescribed apprentice uniform, simple tunics with their master's badge sewn at the shoulder, no decorative elements whatsoever. One boy, perhaps 14, keeps tugging at his collar, clearly uncomfortable in the rough fabric. You remember that feeling from your own apprentice years. You also remember the tailor's boy, who got caught wearing a stolen silk ribbon in his cap and spent 3 days in the stocks for it. The punishment wasn't just about the theft, it was about the violation of the visual order. He'd tried to signal a status he hadn't earned, and the community responded by publicly humiliating him back into his proper place. Women's clothing faced even stricter regulation. A merchant's wife could wear silver jewellery, but not gold. A knight's wife could wear fur trim, but only certain types. Squirrel and rabbit, yes. Ermine and sable, no. Prostitutes in many towns were required to wear distinctive clothing, often including coloured hoods or striped sleeves that marked them immediately. This wasn't just moralism, it was practical urban management. City authorities wanted to prevent honest women from being propositioned by mistake and wanted clients to easily locate sex workers in designated areas. The clothing laws created a legible landscape of identity and availability. Enforcement varied wildly. In London and major cities, special officials inspected markets and public gatherings, fining violators on the spot. Court records overflow with cases. A draper's widow fined for wearing a gown too costly for her degree. A yeoman farmer punished for buttons of excessive showiness. A servant girl caught in her mistress's cast-off silk kirtle. But in rural villages like yours, enforcement was spottier, often left to community gossip and peer pressure. If you showed up to market wearing something suspiciously fine, your neighbours would talk, and that talk would eventually reach the manor court. The laws did have loopholes, and clever people exploited them. Since regulations often specified materials but not quality of construction, skilled tailors made wealthy merchants look impressively refined, using technically legal fabrics cut and tailored to perfection. Hand-me-downs and gifts occupied a legal grey zone. If a noble gave you his old tunic, could you wear it? Technically no, but proving your clothing was gifted rather than purchased was nearly impossible, and foreign visitors often ignored English sumptuary laws entirely, creating exotic spectacles that both fascinated and irritated local authorities. What's oddly touching is how much effort people put into working around these restrictions. Archaeological evidence shows that even poor labourers modified their clothing with small flourishes, carefully mended patches in contrasting thread that created patterns, buttons carved from bone with intricate designs, embroidery worked into hems where it wouldn't be immediately visible. The impulse to express individuality and aesthetic preference pushed against legal conformity constantly, creating a quiet, ongoing negotiation between law and desire. You arrive home and hang your Sunday tunic on its peg, changing into your work clothes, even plainer, even more worn. Tomorrow you'll be back in the fields, and these garments will mark you as clearly as a neon sign marks a shop today. Farmer, labourer, common, not rich, not noble, not anyone who matters to the people who make laws, but at least you know exactly where you stand, and so does everyone else. In a world of uncertainties, that clarity is almost comforting. You finish your ale and step back into the afternoon sunlight, squinting as your eyes adjust. A merchant passes you on the street, and you know immediately that he's a merchant, not because you recognize his face, but because of what he's wearing. His gown falls to mid-calf, made of fine wool dyed a deep burgundy, and his belt is leather with modest silver fittings. Not too fancy, not too plain. Exactly what the law requires for a man of his station. You glance down at your own clothing, undyed woolen tunic, linen undershift, leather boots that have been resoled twice. This too is precisely what the law allows for someone of your class. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, where what you wear isn't a personal choice, it's a legal obligation, and breaking it can land you in serious trouble. Sumptuary legislation, from the Latin sumptuarius, relating to expense, dictated who could wear what based on social rank, occupation, and income. These laws emerged across medieval Europe, but England's versions were particularly detailed and obsessively enforced. The Statute of 1363, for instance, spelled out exactly which fabrics, colours, furs, and ornaments each social tier could use. Knights and their families could wear velvet and silk. Wealthy merchants could wear wool, but not ermine. Labourers and farmers, people like you, were restricted to coarse wool and linen, with strict prohibitions on any gold thread, imported fabrics, or dyes that cost more than a few pennies per yard. Why this mania for controlling fashion? The surface explanation was moral. Authorities claimed they were preventing pride, vanity, and the sin of aping one's betters. Preachers thundered from pulpits about peasants who dressed above their station. warning that such presumption invited divine punishment and social chaos. But dig deeper, and you find economic anxiety driving these laws. Medieval England's economy depended on everyone knowing their place and staying there. If a wealthy merchant's daughter dressed identically to a baroness, how could you tell them apart? How could the social hierarchy function if visual markers of rank disappeared? The economic concerns were surprisingly sophisticated. England imported expensive fabrics, silk from Italy, fine wool from Flanders, fur from Scandinavia, and authorities worried that excessive demand for luxury goods drained national wealth. By restricting who could purchase these items, sumptuary laws theoretically kept money circulating domestically and prevented the lower classes from bankrupting themselves trying to dress fashionably. There's a genuine paternalism here, mixed with protectionism. The government essentially said, "We'll save you from your own aspirational spending by making it illegal." But there's another layer that historians still argue about: social legibility. In a world without identification documents, credit cards, or databases, your clothing was your ID badge. A quick glance told observers your approximate wealth, your profession, your marital status, sometimes even your hometown. Sumptuary laws preserved this instant visual communication system. When a richly dressed stranger rode into town, everyone immediately deferred appropriately or watched him suspiciously if his clothing seemed too fine for his behavior. The system only worked if the signals remained standardized and enforceable. You pass a group of apprentices in the street, all wearing the prescribed apprentice uniform, simple tunics with their master's badge sewn at the shoulder, no decorative elements whatsoever. One boy, perhaps 14, keeps tugging at his collar, clearly uncomfortable in the rough fabric. You remember that feeling from your own apprentice years. You also remember the tailor's boy who got caught wearing a stolen silk ribbon in his cap and spent 3 days in the stocks for it. The punishment wasn't just about the theft, it was about the violation of the visual order. He'd tried to signal a status he hadn't earned, and the community responded by publicly humiliating him back into his proper place. Women's clothing faced even stricter regulation. A merchant's wife could wear silver jewellery but not gold. A knight's wife could wear fur trim but only certain types. Squirrel and rabbit, yes. Ermine and sable, no. Prostitutes in many towns were required to wear distinctive clothing, often including coloured hoods or striped sleeves that marked them immediately. This wasn't just moralism, it was practical urban management. City authorities wanted to prevent honest women from being propositioned by mistake and wanted clients to easily locate sex workers in designated areas. The clothing laws created a legible landscape of identity and availability. Enforcement varied wildly. In London and major cities, special officials inspected markets and public gatherings, fining violators on the spot. Court records overflow with cases. A draper's widow fined for wearing a gown too costly for her degree. A yeoman farmer punished for buttons of excessive showiness. A servant girl caught in her mistress's cast-off silk kirtle. But in rural villages like yours, enforcement was spottier, often left to community gossip and peer pressure. If you showed up to market wearing something suspiciously fine, your neighbours would talk, and that talk would eventually reach the manor court. The laws did have loopholes, and clever people exploited them. Since regulations often specified materials but not quality of construction, skilled tailors made wealthy merchants look impressively refined, using technically legal fabrics cut and tailored to perfection. Hand-me-downs and gifts occupied a legal grey zone. If a noble gave you his old tunic, could you wear it? Technically no, but proving your clothing was gifted rather than purchased was nearly impossible. And foreign visitors often ignored English sumptuary laws entirely, creating exotic spectacles that both fascinated and irritated local authorities. What's oddly touching is how much effort people put into working around these restrictions. Archaeological evidence shows that even poor labourers modified their clothing with small flourishes, carefully mended patches in contrasting thread that created patterns, buttons carved from bone with intricate designs, embroidery worked into hems where it wouldn't be immediately visible. The impulse to express individuality and aesthetic preference pushed against legal conformity constantly, creating a quiet, ongoing negotiation between law and desire. You arrive home and hang your Sunday tunic on its peg, changing into your work clothes, even plainer, even more worn. Tomorrow you'll be back in the fields, and these garments will mark you as clearly as a neon sign marks a shop today. Farmer, labourer, common. Not rich, not noble, not anyone who matters to the people who make laws, but at least you know exactly where you stand, and so does everyone else. In a world of uncertainties, that clarity is almost comforting. You wake Monday morning to pre-dawn darkness, splash cold water on your face, and head to the bakehouse where you've worked as a journeyman for 3 years now. The master baker, Geoffrey, is already kneading dough, his thick forearms working the mass with practiced rhythm. The ovens are heating, filling the room with dry warmth that will soon become oppressive. You tie on your apron and reach for the next batch of dough, and then Geoffrey's voice cuts through the quiet. No singing today, mind you. Alderman's been complaining again. You swallow your usual work song and nod. The no singing rule seems petty, even cruel, but it exists for a reason that makes perfect sense once you understand the science of medieval baking. Bread was the foundation of medieval diet, the absolute cornerstone that kept people alive. A labourer might consume 2 pounds of bread daily. When bread failed, people starved. No pressure on the baker, right? But bread is finicky, a precise dance of ratios, temperatures, and timing that could go catastrophically wrong with even minor distraction. The fermentation process that transforms flour, water, yeast, and salt into edible bread depends on exact timing and environmental conditions. Too little rising time, and your bread is dense, heavy, nearly indigestible. Too much rising time, and it becomes sour or collapses into flat disappointment. Medieval bakers didn't have thermometers, timers, or standardized measurements. They had experience, intuition, and complete unbroken focus. Singing disrupted that focus. It changed your breathing rhythm, altered your sense of time, and most critically, distracted you during crucial moments when you needed to judge doneness, check fermentation progress, or rotate loaves in the oven. A baker who burst into song while loading the oven might misjudge placement and burn half his batch. One who hummed cheerfully while checking dough might miss the telltale signs that fermentation had progressed too far. And since most bakehouses produced hundreds of loaves daily for sale, a single mistake didn't just mean one bad loaf. It meant dozens, perhaps hundreds of disappointed customers and significant financial loss. The guild regulations are explicit and unforgiving on this point. In several English towns, bakers' guild statutes from the 14th and 15th centuries specifically prohibit singing, whistling, or engaging in idle chatter while bread is in process. Violations brought fines, and repeat offenders could lose their guild membership, which effectively ended their career. The rules applied to masters and apprentices alike. Even customers were sometimes barred from the bakehouse during critical work hours because their conversation might distract the baker at a crucial moment. There's also an acoustic element that historians still debate. Experienced bakers claim they could hear the bread baking, subtle crackles and pops that indicated crust formation, faint hissing that suggested too much moisture, even the quality of silence that meant proper rising. If you filled the bakehouse with song, you couldn't hear these delicate auditory cues. Your bread became a visual guessing game rather than a multi-sensory monitoring process. Modern professional bakers sometimes report similar phenomena, describing how they listen to bread even in noisy commercial kitchens, straining to catch the acoustic signatures of proper baking beneath ambient noise. You work in silence now, hands moving through familiar motions, dividing dough, shaping loaves, scoring tops with quick knife strokes that will guide how the crust splits as it bakes. Geoffrey works beside you, equally quiet, and there's an almost meditative quality to the shared wordlessness. Your breathing synchronizes with the rhythm of kneading. Your attention narrows to the immediate task, the texture of this particular dough, the temperature of the oven as tested with a hand held briefly near the opening, the pale gold color creeping across the loave's surfaces as they transform from raw to ready. The master baker's reputation depended entirely on consistency. If his bread varied wildly from day to day, today's loaf perfect, tomorrow's a disaster, customers would take their business elsewhere, and in a town with perhaps only 3 or 4 bakers, losing market share was catastrophic. The no-singing rule was part of a broader system of quality control that included standardized dough mixing procedures, strict oven temperature management, and regulated ingredients. Everything conspired to create reliable, predictable results, and anything that threatened consistency, including the distraction of song, had to be eliminated. Do you remember the ale taster from yesterday? Bakers face similar oversight, actually more severe. The assize of bread, a set of regulations dating back to the 13th century, fixed bread prices based on grain costs and mandated minimum loaf weights. Inspectors regularly tested loaves, and bakers who shortchanged customers faced brutal public punishment. You've seen it yourself. A baker dragged through the streets in a wooden pillory, his undersized loaves hung around his neck, while townspeople pelted him with refuse and shouted insults. The humiliation was intense and intentional, a warning to every baker that quality mattered more than profit. Given those stakes, the no-singing rule seems almost generous. Better to work in silence than to work in the stocks. You slide a wooden peel under a row of risen loaves and transfer them to the oven's stone floor, feeling the blast of heat against your face. No song escapes your lips, though part of you aches to hum the melody your father used to sing while mending harnesses. Work songs made labor tolerable, transformed tedious repetition into rhythm and community. But you understand the trade-off. Geoffrey's Bakehouse produces bread that people trust, bread that rises properly and browns evenly and tastes the way bread should taste. That reputation keeps you employed and keeps the neighborhood fed. By mid-morning, the first batch is cooling on racks, filling the bakehouse with that incomparable aroma of fresh bread, yeasty, wheaty, slightly sweet. Your shoulders ache and your hands are dusted with flour, but the loaves are good, every single one. That's the proof that silence works. You're standing at the bakehouse window, looking out at the street as you wipe flour from your hands, when you spot the commotion. A baker from the next street over, Martin, a man you know casually, is being led toward the market square by 2 constables. And there's something deeply wrong with the scene. Martin isn't in chains exactly, but he's trapped inside a wooden pillory carried on a cart, and hanging from the framework around his neck are loaves of bread. Not good bread. These loaves are misshapen, undersized, clearly the evidence of his crime. The crowd following the cart jeers and laughs, and someone throws a rotten cabbage that splatters across Martin's shoulder. You wince in sympathy and dread. This is the assize of bread in action, and it's a reminder that your profession comes with consequences more severe than almost any other trade. The assize of bread and ale was royal legislation dating back to 1266. Though similar regulations existed even earlier, it established a direct relationship between grain prices and bread prices, creating a sliding scale that theoretically prevented bakers from profiteering during shortages while also ensuring they could make a living during abundant harvests. Inspectors, usually appointed by town officials, regularly purchased loaves from every baker, weighed them against standard measures, and checked quality. If your loaf came up short, if it was adulterated with sawdust or chalk to stretch the flour, if it was undercooked or burnt beyond palatability, you faced punishment. And not just fines. Public, physical, humiliating punishment designed to destroy your reputation. The pillory was the most common sentence for bakers who violated the assize. You'd be locked in the wooden frame, head and hands immobilized, and displayed in the market square for hours, sometimes an entire day. Your fraudulent loaves would hang around your neck as evidence and accusation. Townspeople were actively encouraged to throw things at you: spoiled food, mud, occasionally stones, though authorities tried to prevent actual injury. The psychological torture was arguably worse than the physical discomfort. Everyone you knew, everyone you'd sold bread to, everyone whose children played with your children, they all saw you there, exposed as a cheat and a failure. Some towns employed an even more theatrical punishment: the baker's hurdle. You'd be strapped to a wooden sledge along with your bad bread, then dragged through the streets behind a horse while a crier announced your crime to every neighborhood. The journey deliberately past your own bakehouse, your competitors' shops, your customers' homes, and the main market. By the time you reached the final destination, usually the pillory again, you'd been thoroughly humiliated before every relevant witness in town. Your reputation was in ruins, and in a medieval economy where reputation was currency, that meant your livelihood might never recover. Why such harsh punishment for what seems like a relatively minor economic crime? Because bread fraud wasn't minor. Bread was survival. When you shortchanged a customer by an ounce or two per loaf, you were quite literally stealing food from their mouths. A labourer who purchased bread daily and consistently received underweight loaves might lose enough nutrition to affect his health and working capacity. A family that bought from a dishonest baker might see their children go hungry. During times of genuine scarcity, when grain prices spiked and people were already struggling, bread fraud could push vulnerable families from difficulty into starvation. The assize also protected bakers, though this aspect often gets overlooked. By establishing official price ceilings based on grain costs, the regulations prevented cutthroat competition that might bankrupt all bakers in a race to the bottom. If Martin had been caught undercharging, selling bread below the assize price, he'd face similar punishment for disrupting the market equilibrium. The system aimed for stability and fairness, though how well it achieved those goals remains a topic historians still argue about. You watch Martin's cart disappear around a corner, the jeering crowd trailing after it. Geoffrey appears beside you, wiping his hands on his apron. "Caught him with loaves 4 ounces light," he mutters. "Third offence. He'll lose his guild membership after this." You both know what that means. Without guild protection, Martin can't legally operate a bakehouse. He'll have to find other work, unskilled labour, probably, for significantly less income. His family will suffer, all because he shaved a bit off each loaf, trying to stretch his flour supply, trying to eke out slightly higher profit margins. The temptation must have been enormous, and it broke him. Geoffrey taps your shoulder. "That's why we weigh every batch," he says quietly. "Why we measure twice. Why I'd rather throw out a questionable loaf than sell it and risk inspection. It's a lesson you've absorbed through observation, but hearing it stated plainly drives it home. Your master runs a careful, honest operation, not just from moral principle, but from cold calculation. One bad inspection could destroy everything he's built over 20 years. The risk isn't worth any potential reward. The assize inspectors were surprisingly sophisticated in their methods. They didn't just weigh finished loaves, they sometimes tested flour quality, checked for adulterants, and even tracked weather conditions that might affect baking. They understood that rainy weather could increase dough hydration, that winter cold might slow rising, that summer heat could speed fermentation unpredictably. Good inspectors made allowances for these variables, judging whether a slightly light loaf resulted from criminal intent or from genuinely difficult conditions. Bad inspectors applied the rules rigidly, creating terror and resentment. You've been fortunate. Your town's current inspector is fair, knowledgeable, and only harsh when dishonesty is clear. There's something grimly egalitarian about the assize. Rich bakers and poor bakers face identical scrutiny. A baker who supplied the Lord's household got no special treatment if his bread ran light. The rules protected consumers regardless of status, which in a highly stratified society was remarkably progressive. Of course, wealthy bakers could better afford the occasional fine and could hire lawyers to contest charges, while poor bakers like Martin had no such cushion. The law was equal in theory. In practice, as always, wealth brought resilience. You return to work, and Geoffrey immediately puts you on weighing duty for the next batch. You measure each loaf carefully, noting the weights in chalk on the workbench. Every single one meets or exceeds the required weight. Relief washes through you, not because you doubted Geoffrey, but because you've just witnessed what happens when things go wrong. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that your hands produced honest bread. And tomorrow you'll do it again, carefully, precisely, with the image of Martin in the pillory burned into your memory as a permanent reminder of what's at stake. You're walking home from the bakehouse, exhausted and looking forward to whatever simple supper awaits, when you nearly trip over a pig rooting through garbage in the middle of the street. You curse and sidestep the animal, a large sow, muddy and aggressive, as it grunts and continues tearing apart a pile of vegetable scraps someone dumped outside their door. This isn't unusual. Pigs wander freely through most medieval towns, serving as living garbage disposals that consume organic waste and keep streets marginally cleaner than they'd otherwise be. But lately, there's been talk. The town council held a meeting last week about banning pigs from urban streets entirely, and while some residents protested, where else would waste go, others supported the measure enthusiastically. The debate isn't abstract philosophical musing. It started because a pig killed a child. The incident happened in London in 1322, though similar tragedies occurred across Europe throughout the medieval period. Prince William, the young son of a nobleman, was walking through the city when a large pig roaming the streets startled, charged, and knocked him down. The boy struck his head on cobblestones and died from the injury. The city erupted in grief and rage, and within weeks, London enacted strict regulations prohibiting pigs from running loose in certain districts. The law wasn't just about one dead child, though that death certainly catalyzed action. It was about the accumulated evidence that free-roaming pigs, animals that could weigh 300 pounds and possessed surprising speed and aggression, were genuinely dangerous in crowded urban environments. Pigs attacked people with disturbing regularity. Medieval court records document dozens of cases. A pig biting a toddler's face, a sow knocking over an elderly woman who then broke her hip, a boar goring a drunk man who stumbled too close. Pigs also damaged property, destroyed merchant goods left unattended, and created sanitation problems that paradoxically made them less useful as waste disposers than their proponents claimed. A pig eating garbage is one thing. A pig defecating prolifically while eating garbage is quite another. Streets became slippery with pig waste, creating additional hazards and contributing to the general stench that made medieval cities notoriously unpleasant. But banning pigs created its own problems, which is why you're hearing such heated debate. Urban waste disposal was genuinely challenging. People dumped organic refuse, vegetable scraps, spoiled food, butchering remains, into streets because there was nowhere else to put it. Without pigs to consume some of it, the waste simply accumulated, rotting and attracting rats. Rats brought fleas. Fleas carried disease. In cities that had experienced plague outbreaks, the memory of mass death made people terrified of anything that might increase rat populations. So some argued that dangerous pigs were preferable to plague-bearing rats. Pick your poison, essentially. The compromise solution emerging in many towns was zoning. Pigs could roam freely in outer districts and poorest neighborhoods, but were banned from market squares, wealthy residential areas, and major thoroughfares. Enforcement relied on sworn pig keepers who were responsible for keeping their animals controlled and faced fines if their pigs wandered into prohibited zones. You've seen these pig keepers, usually children or elderly family members, trailing after small herds with sticks, trying to herd animals that have minimal interest in being herded. It's frustrating work, poorly paid, and only partially effective. Historians still argue whether urban pig keeping was net positive or negative for medieval public health. Some scholars point to pigs' waste consumption as genuinely valuable, noting that cities without pigs faced worse garbage accumulation and potentially higher disease rates. Others counter that pig-related injuries, pig waste contamination of water supplies, and the general chaos of loose livestock in urban spaces outweighed any sanitation benefits. The truth probably varied by city size, population density, and how well regulations were enforced. What's certain is that medieval people recognized the problem and tried to solve it, sometimes in delightfully specific ways. Certain English towns required pig keepers to fit their animals with special wooden yokes, essentially heavy wooden frames hung around the pig's neck that prevented it from squeezing through narrow gaps or entering buildings but didn't impede normal movement. Archaeological evidence confirms these yokes existed. Museum collections include several surviving examples. The yoke transformed the pig from a nimble urban gorilla into a slower, more visible, easier-to-catch animal. You watch the sow in front of you, still rooting enthusiastically through garbage, and you remember the current proposal circulating through town. A complete ban on pigs within the market district, with a designated pig yard established at the town's edge, where swine could be penned and fed collected garbage brought by cart. It's a more organized system, certainly more controlled, but it requires labor, resources, and coordination that your small town barely possesses. Someone has to collect the garbage, someone has to transport it, someone has to manage the pig yard, and someone has to pay for all of it, which likely means new taxes that nobody wants. The pig finally waddles away, satisfied with its meal, and you continue homeward. You pass a woman chasing two piglets with a broom, shouting at them in language that would make a sailor blush. You pass a merchant boarding up his shop's lower windows with heavy planks. Pig-proofing, you realize, protecting his goods from nighttime raids by enterprising swine. You pass a constable posting a new ordinance on the church door. Effective next month, all pigs must be kept on leashes within 200 yards of the market cross. Penalty 5 shillings per offence. There's something almost comical about the whole situation. Grown adults devoting enormous energy to pig policy, councils convening solemn meetings about swine management, legal codes expanding to address livestock infractions. But then you remember that dead child, and it stops being funny. The pig that killed Prince William was just being a pig, acting on animal instinct, startled by something and reacting with its considerable physical power. No malice, no intent, just an animal in an environment where it didn't belong, and a child who happened to be in the wrong place. That tragedy could be prevented, should be prevented, if only humans could figure out a system that balanced waste management, public safety, and economic reality. You arrive home to find your own small vegetable garden has been ravaged. A pig pushed through the wattle fence and destroyed half your cabbages. You stand there looking at the torn plants and muddy hoof prints, and feel the frustration that makes urban pig bans suddenly seem perfectly reasonable. Tomorrow you'll repair the fence. Next week the pig might break through again, and the debate will continue, because in a medieval town there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs, compromises, and the hope that your particular street stays slightly less chaotic than the next one over. You wake the next morning with a throbbing headache and a general sense of malaise that tells you something's wrong with your humours. or at least that's how you'd explain it. The only solution is a visit to the barber surgeon, whose shop sits near the town well, marked by the distinctive red and white striped pole outside. You arrive mid-morning to find two other patients already waiting, a farmer with an infected hand and an older woman who needs a tooth pulled. The barber surgeon, a capable man named Hugh, greets you cheerfully and assesses your complaint. "Bloodletting, then," he announces. "We'll balance those humours and have you right by evening." You settle onto the stool and extend your arm, but then Hugh glances at the window, notes the sun's position, and shakes his head. "Come back this afternoon. Can't let blood before noon, and we stop entirely at sunset. Town rules." You're annoyed but unsurprised. The prohibition on nighttime medical procedures, particularly bloodletting, is strictly enforced across most of medieval Europe, and for once you actually understand why. Bloodletting, the most common medical intervention of the era, involved opening a vein with a lancet and allowing a specific amount of blood to drain into a bowl. The procedure was based on humoral theory. Your body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness resulted from imbalance. Too much blood? Drain some off. The theory was wrong, of course, but the practice was nearly universal, prescribed for everything from headaches to plague. The problem was that bloodletting, done incorrectly, could kill you very quickly. Nick the wrong vessel, cut too deeply, or fail to stop the bleeding properly, and a patient could bleed out in minutes. In bright daylight, with the sun streaming through windows, Hugh could see exactly what he was doing. Identify the correct vein, judge the depth of his cut, monitor the blood flow and the patient's colour. Recognize the signs of dangerous blood loss before it became fatal. In candlelight or rushlight, those same visual cues became ambiguous, difficult, sometimes impossible to read accurately. Shadows distorted depth perception. Flickering light made it hard to distinguish between healthy pallor and dangerous exsanguination. The risk of fatal error multiplied exponentially after dark. Town regulations responded accordingly. Most English municipalities banned bloodletting, tooth extraction, and surgical procedures after sunset. Some extended the prohibition to cloudy days or periods of poor natural light. Barber surgeons who violated these rules faced steep fines, loss of guild membership, or in cases where a patient died, criminal prosecution for negligent homicide. The laws acknowledged a simple truth. Medieval medicine was dangerous enough in optimal conditions. In poor lighting, it became effectively lethal. Hugh's shop is carefully positioned to maximize natural light. Large windows face south and east, capturing morning and afternoon sun. The treatment chair sits directly beneath the largest window. Even the walls are whitewashed to reflect available light, brightening the space as much as primitive architecture allows. These aren't aesthetic choices, they're survival measures. Hugh's attempt to reduce the odds that he'll accidentally kill someone through a simple procedural error committed in poor visibility. You return that afternoon as instructed, and this time the light is perfect, clear, strong, direct. Hugh works efficiently, tying a cord around your upper arm to raise the vein, swabbing the site with wine, then making a precise shallow cut with a lancet he sharpened to razor keenness. Blood flows steadily into a ceramic bowl, and Hugh watches both the blood and your face with equal attention. "Good colour," he murmurs. "Strong flow. We'll take about half a pint." You feel lightheaded but not faint, weak but not dangerously so. After what feels like 10 minutes but is probably less, Hugh pinches the wound closed and wraps it with clean linen. "Rest today. Light food, no heavy labour." You nod, already feeling the peculiar relief that follows bloodletting, whether from actual medical benefit or simply the psychological comfort of having done something you can't say. Historians still argue whether the nighttime surgery ban was primarily about patient safety or about professional regulation. Some scholars suggest the barber surgeons' guilds promoted these rules to limit competition, ensuring that only guild members with proper shops and equipment could practice, while itinerant practitioners and folk healers who worked by firelight in patients' homes were effectively criminalized. Others point to genuine concern for patient welfare, noting that medical guilds also regulated training, required apprenticeships, and established standards that demonstrably improved outcomes. The ban had interesting side effects. Medical emergencies that occurred at night simply had to wait until dawn, unless the situation was so dire that attempting treatment in poor light seemed less risky than doing nothing. Court records document cases where patients bled through the night from accidents or violence, with barber surgeons standing by but legally forbidden to intervene until sunrise. Some died waiting. The laws prioritized preventing medical error over treating every emergency immediately, a calculation that saved some lives and cost others. There was also the issue of pain management. Medieval medicine used wine, poppy preparations, and sometimes mandrake for anesthesia, but these were unpredictable and dangerous in their own right. A surgeon working at night couldn't accurately judge whether a patient was merely sedated or dangerously over-medicated until symptoms became obvious, and by then intervention might come too late. Daylight allowed for better monitoring of patients under sedation, catching the warning signs of respiratory depression or cardiovascular collapse before they became irreversible. You leave Hugh's shop feeling drained but oddly satisfied, your wrapped arm throbbing gently. The sun is still well above the horizon. Hours of good working light remain. You notice Hugh already preparing for his next patient, arranging instruments on a cloth spread beneath the window, checking his lancets against the light to ensure they're properly sharp. He works with the efficiency of someone who knows that his window of operating time is limited, that darkness will eventually come and end his working day whether he's finished or not. Do you remember the baker who couldn't sing while working? There's a parallel here. Both professions demand absolute focus and optimal conditions because the consequences of error are severe. Hugh can't afford distraction any more than Geoffrey could. One moment of inattention, one cut made in poor light, one failure to notice a patient's declining condition, and Hugh joins Martin in the pillory, or worse, stands trial for manslaughter. The nighttime ban isn't oppression, it's Hugh's protection, the community's protection, and ultimately, your protection. Better to wait until morning and survive than to insist on immediate treatment and bleed out in the dark because your barber surgeon couldn't see what he was doing. You're nursing your bandaged arm at home the next day when a commotion erupts in the street outside. You peer through your shutters to see two men facing each other in the square, and one has just struck the other across the face with his leather glove. The slap echoes like a whip crack, and the crowd that's gathering gasps collectively. This isn't a simple brawl brewing, this is a formal challenge to a duel, conducted according to precise legal ritual, and what happens next will follow rules so detailed and specific that they'd make a modern lawyer's head spin. The glove-slapping duel system seems like pure theatrical violence, the kind of barbaric custom that confirms every stereotype about medieval brutality. But dig deeper, and you'll find it was actually a violence reduction strategy, a way of channeling murderous rage into controlled, regulated combat that saved more lives than it took. The man who was slapped, a merchant named Robert, you recognize him now, has several options. He can accept the challenge, in which case formal duel procedures commence. He can refuse and lose his honor but keep his life. Or he can appeal to authorities to mediate the dispute, though doing so brands him as cowardly in community eyes. Robert hesitates only a moment before nodding curtly. I accept. Name your terms. And just like that, what might have been an alley stabbing or a midnight ambush becomes a legal proceeding with witnesses, rules, and oversight. The dual challenge system emerged from a grim reality. Medieval people carried weapons routinely, tempers ran hot, and without formal conflict resolution mechanisms, insults and disputes escalated into blood feuds that could span generations. A man insulted at market might ambush his enemy that night. The victim's family would retaliate. Soon, entire family networks were locked in cycles of revenge killings that decimated communities. The formalized duel system interrupted that cycle by transforming personal violence into public spectacle governed by law. Here's how it worked. Once a challenge was issued and accepted, both parties appeared before local authorities, usually the Lord Steward or town magistrate, who recorded the grievance, ensured both men understood the stakes, and attempted reconciliation. Many disputes ended here, with officials mediating settlements and requiring public apologies or financial compensation. If reconciliation failed, officials set terms: weapons allowed, combat location, date and time, and conditions for victory. Both duelists posted bonds guaranteeing they'd appear. Friends and family could attend but couldn't interfere on pain of severe punishment. The weapons restrictions are fascinating and reveal the system's underlying logic. Combatants had to use identical weapons, both swords, both clubs, both daggers, to ensure fairness. Armor was often prohibited or limited to identical pieces provided by authorities. The goal wasn't to stage an execution, but to test which man God favored, based on the widespread belief that divine justice would grant victory to the righteous party. Yes, it's trial by combat, and yes, modern sensibilities recoil, but medieval people genuinely believed this worked, and the system's structure shows they wanted fair divine judgment, not simple murder. The combat itself followed strict protocols. Officials marked a boundary, usually a circle or square, and leaving it meant forfeiture. Combatants fought until one died, yielded, or became incapacitated. Yielding was explicitly allowed and carried no dishonor beyond losing the dispute. A man who yielded was expected to make public concessions, apologize, pay compensation, sometimes leave town. But he lived. Compare this to blood feuds where surrender meant nothing, and conflicts ended only with complete annihilation of one family line. Historians still argue whether trial by combat reduced violence or simply formalized it. Skeptics note that men still died in these duels, that the strong could terrorize the weak with impunity, that divine judgment theory provided cover for might makes right brutality. Defenders counter that formalized dueling replaced something worse: unchecked vendetta killings that claimed far more lives and destabilized entire regions. Court records suggest that most formal challenges never reached actual combat. The ritual itself, with its cooling-off period and official mediation, resolved disputes peacefully more often than not. You watch Robert and his challenger, a butcher named Thomas, you think, being led away by the constable toward the manor house for official recording. Their friends trail after them, already arguing about terms and weapons. The crowd disperses, buzzing with speculation. Will they actually fight? What was the original insult? Thomas accused Robert of cheating him on fabric weight, someone says. Robert called Thomas a liar and a pig-keeper's son, another adds. Insults that, left unaddressed, would fester into hatred and possible violence. The glove itself carries symbolic weight. Gloves were expensive, personal items that represented one's honor and identity. To slap someone with your glove was to literally throw down your honor as a challenge. The victim picking up that glove signified accepting not just the duel, but the underlying accusation that honor was at stake. Refusing to pick up the glove, or refusing the duel after picking it up, broadcast that you valued life over honor, a position that carried social consequences but increasingly found acceptance as medieval period progressed and commercial values began overshadowing warrior culture. Women couldn't participate in formal duels, obvious patriarchal limitation, but they could sometimes appoint champions to fight on their behalf if accused of crimes or challenged over property disputes. These champion fights followed identical rules but carried extra complexity since the champion fought for hire or loyalty rather than personal grievance. Some men made careers as professional champions, traveling between towns offering their services. It was dangerous work but potentially lucrative, and successful champions achieved celebrity status. The most remarkable aspect of the duel system is how it made violence legible and limited. Instead of random murders in dark alleys, combat happened in public, at announced times, under official supervision, with clear rules and witnesses. Authorities could track who killed whom and why. Survivors couldn't claim self-defense ambiguity. Either the duel was legal and sanctioned, or the killing was murder. The system created documentation, accountability, and most importantly, endpoints. A properly conducted duel settled the dispute permanently. The loser's family couldn't seek revenge without violating law and community norms. 3 days later, you hear that Robert and Thomas never fought. The magistrate mediated a settlement. Robert apologized publicly and reduced Thomas's debt by half. Thomas acknowledged he'd spoken hastily and bought Robert a barrel of wine to seal the reconciliation. Both men's honor was satisfied without bloodshed. The system worked exactly as designed. The glove-slapping that seemed so dramatic and violent was actually the first step in a process that prevented violence more often than it caused it. Tonight, both men are alive, their families aren't plotting revenge, and the community avoided a destabilizing conflict. That's not barbarism. That's surprisingly sophisticated conflict resolution dressed in theatrical costume. You're walking past the church on Sunday evening when you notice something unusual. A rough-looking man you don't recognize sitting on the church steps, eating bread and cheese that the priest's housekeeper has clearly provided. He's filthy, nervous, and keeps glancing toward the road as though expecting pursuers. You don't need to ask what's happening, you know. This man has claimed sanctuary, the ancient right that allows criminals to seek refuge in holy spaces, and for the next 40 days, he's untouchable. No constable can arrest him, no victim's family can exact revenge, no authority can drag him out. The church has become his fortress, and medieval law backs this arrangement with surprising force. It seems like a criminal's loophole, a way for guilty men to escape justice. But sanctuary served crucial functions that kept medieval society from tearing itself apart through endless cycles of revenge. The concept of church sanctuary predates medieval Christianity, with roots in ancient Roman and Germanic traditions, but the Catholic Church formalized and expanded it throughout Europe. The basic principle was straightforward. Any person, guilty or innocent, who reached consecrated ground and declared sanctuary received temporary protection from secular authorities. Most sanctuaries lasted 40 days, though some churches offered permanent asylum for specific crimes. During this period, the fugitive couldn't be forcibly removed, and anyone who violated sanctuary risked excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that medieval people genuinely feared. Why did secular authorities tolerate this system that seemingly undermined their power? Because sanctuary provided a pressure release valve for justice systems that often operated more on passion than procedure. When a crime occurred, a killing, a theft, a violent assault, the immediate response was usually rage. Victims' families wanted blood, communities wanted swift punishment, and mob justice could easily spiral into vigilante killings that ignored questions of guilt, self-defense, or mitigating circumstances. Sanctuary forced a cooling-off period. 40 days gave heated emotions time to subside, allowed investigators to gather facts, and created space for negotiation between the fugitive and the aggrieved parties. The man on the church steps looks like he's killed someone, based on his extreme anxiety and the way he keeps checking the road. If he'd been caught immediately after the crime, he might have been lynched by the victim's family or friends before any official investigation could occur. Sanctuary saved his life and simultaneously served justice by preserving him for proper legal proceedings. Over the next 40 days, authorities will investigate what actually happened. Was it murder or self-defense? Was there provocation? Are there witnesses who can clarify events? These questions require time to answer, and Sanctuary provides that time. The Sanctuary rules were surprisingly detailed and strictly enforced. The fugitive had to remain on church grounds, not just in the building but within the consecrated boundary, which usually included the churchyard. He couldn't leave to work, visit family, or conduct business. The parish provided minimal food and water, but life was deliberately uncomfortable to discourage casual abuse of the system. Church officials recorded the fugitive's name, crime, and entry date in official registers. After 40 days, the fugitive faced a choice: stand trial or accept permanent exile through a process called abjuring the realm. Abjuring the realm was its own bizarre ritual. The fugitive appeared before church officials and swore an oath to leave England forever, never to return on pain of immediate execution. He was assigned a specific port, usually the nearest coastal town, and given a direct route he had to follow, travelling a certain distance each day under supervision. He wore distinctive clothing marking him as an abjurer and carried a wooden cross. Anyone who killed him during this journey to exile faced murder charges, but he also couldn't deviate from his assigned path or delay his departure. It was structured banishment, removing the criminal from society without executing him and giving victims' families the satisfaction of knowing he'd never return. Historians still argue whether Sanctuary primarily protected the innocent or sheltered the guilty. Records show both outcomes: genuine self-defense cases where Sanctuary saved wrongly accused men from lynch mobs, and clear-cut murders where guilty killers exploited church protection to escape punishment. The system's defenders note that even guilty men deserved due process rather than street justice, and that Sanctuary's existence probably prevented numerous revenge killings that would have spawned further violence. Critics point out that wealthy criminals could sometimes negotiate their way out of exile through payments to victims' families, while poor fugitives had no such options and faced permanent banishment regardless of circumstances. You watch the priest emerge from the church and speak quietly with the fugitive, explaining his options and obligations. The priest's role is crucial. He's both protector and jailer, ensuring the fugitive receives basic sustenance while also enforcing the boundaries that keep him confined. Medieval priests took Sanctuary obligations seriously, sometimes facing down armed mobs intent on dragging fugitives out. Church versus state conflicts over Sanctuary rights periodically erupted into major political crises, with kings demanding access to fugitives and bishops threatening excommunication if Sanctuary was violated. The 40-day limit wasn't arbitrary. It was based on biblical and liturgical significance, connecting Sanctuary to broader religious concepts of penance and redemption. 40 days echoed Christ's time in the wilderness, the period of Lent, the flood's duration. The fugitive's Sanctuary period was meant to be spiritually transformative, a time for reflection, confession, and repentance. Whether that actually happened is debatable, but the intention reveals how medieval society tried to weave spiritual rehabilitation into justice systems. Some churches became notorious as sanctuary havens, developing reputations that drew fugitives from across regions. Durham Cathedral in England offered particularly strong sanctuary protections and maintained detailed records of those who claimed it. Archaeological and documentary evidence shows that sanctuary seekers came from all social classes. Nobles fleeing political accusations, merchants accused of fraud, peasants who'd killed in tavern brawls, women fleeing abusive situations. The system's universality meant anyone could potentially access it, which again points to its function as social safety valve rather than simple criminal protection. The fugitive on the church steps will spend the next 40 days in uncomfortable limbo, neither free nor formally imprisoned, his future uncertain. But he's alive, and that's what matters. His victim's family can't kill him in rage-fueled revenge that might trigger a blood feud lasting generations. Authorities have time to investigate properly, and perhaps, just perhaps, during these 40 days, some form of reconciliation might emerge. Compensation negotiated, apologies offered, truth established. Not every sanctuary case ended in exile or execution. Some ended in justice that actually satisfied everyone involved. That possibility existed because sanctuary created time and space for it to develop. Tonight you walk past the church and nod to the fugitive, who looks at you with desperate, grateful eyes. Tomorrow he'll still be there, counting down his 40 days, suspended between crime and consequence, protected by rules that seem strange but serve purposes more sophisticated than they first appear. You're recovering from your bloodletting, your arm still wrapped in linen, when a travelling merchant arrives in town with news from the next county. A woman there was convicted of theft through trial by ordeal, the hot iron test specifically. She carried a red hot iron bar 9 paces, and 3 days later, when the bandages were removed, her hand showed infection and suppuration. Guilty, the court declared, because God's judgment manifested through her festering wound. The merchant shakes his head while relating this, clearly skeptical, but others in the tavern nod knowingly. You're caught between worlds. Part of you understands that infection proves nothing except poor wound care. But another part, the part shaped by a lifetime in medieval society, wonders if perhaps divine judgment really does work in mysterious ways. Trial by ordeal seems like pure superstition to modern minds, but it operated on internal logic that made sense within medieval medical and theological frameworks, and surprisingly, recent historical analysis suggests it might have worked better than expected as a criminal justice tool. Trial by ordeal came in several flavors, each designed to invoke divine judgment on accused criminals when evidence was unclear or conflicting. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a heated iron bar a specified distance, usually 9 paces. The ordeal of cold water involved binding the accused and submerging them in blessed water. Floating indicated guilt because pure water rejected sinners, while sinking suggested innocence. The ordeal of boiling water required retrieving a stone from a cauldron of boiling liquid. In each case, priests blessed the instruments and prayed for God to reveal truth through the accused person's body. The hot iron ordeal's outcome depended entirely on how the wound healed. After carrying the iron, the accused's hand was wrapped in bandages sealed with wax and church officials' marks. 3 days later, authorities unwrapped the hand in formal ceremony before witnesses. If the wound was healing cleanly, what we'd call primary healing without infection, the accused was innocent. If the wound showed infection, pus, spreading redness, or rot, the accused was guilty. Medieval people believed God directly controlled healing, that clean healing was miraculous intervention proving innocence, while infection was divine condemnation of guilt. Here's where it gets interesting. Modern medical historians have noted that infection rates in medieval ordeal wounds were surprisingly low given the lack of antiseptic technique. Some scholars theorize that the ritual surrounding ordeals, the prayers, the waiting period, the formal handling, created psychological pressure that affected outcomes. If you genuinely believed you were innocent and that God would vindicate you, your stress levels might be lower, potentially supporting better immune function and healing. If you knew you were guilty and expected divine punishment, extreme anxiety might compromise your immune response, making infection more likely. It's not divine judgment, but it's also not entirely random. There's also compelling evidence that trial by ordeal functioned more as a confessional pressure tactic than as an actual test. Court records show that many accused criminals confessed before the ordeal was conducted, and others confessed immediately after carrying the iron, but before the bandages were removed 3 days later. The ordeal's real power might have been psychological. Guilty people believing God would expose them regardless, chose confession and mercy over ordeal and certain divine condemnation. This made ordeal an efficient truth extraction tool that didn't require modern interrogation techniques or forensic evidence. The cold water ordeal, the one where you're thrown into blessed water, operated on entirely different logic. Medieval theologians argued that water, having been blessed in baptism as humanity's purifier, would reject sinful bodies just as it rejected dirt and corruption. Therefore, floating proved guilt, while sinking proved innocence. The accused couldn't win either way in practical terms. Sink and you might drown before rescue, float and you're convicted. But most cold water ordeals were conducted with safety lines that allowed quick retrieval, and records show acquittal rates around 50%, suggesting it wasn't simply a guaranteed execution method. Historians still argue whether ordeals were barbaric torture or surprisingly sophisticated justice mechanisms. Critics note the obvious: innocent people died or were maimed, theological reasoning was nonsense, and the procedures amounted to state-sanctioned physical abuse. Defenders point out that ordeals were used relatively rarely, only when other evidence was completely ambiguous, and that conviction rates were far lower than simple chance would predict. A recent statistical analysis of medieval English court records found that ordeal acquittal rates exceeded 60%, suggesting either that most accused people were actually innocent, or that the system had built-in mechanisms favoring acquittal that we don't fully understand. There's also the matter of who administered ordeals. Priests controlled the procedures, blessed the implements, judged the results, and held enormous discretionary power. A sympathetic priest might ensure the iron wasn't quite as hot, might pray longer allowing it to cool, might judge borderline healing as sufficiently clean to acquit. Church officials weren't stupid. They understood the theological stakes of declaring someone guilty or innocent by God's judgment, and they had strong incentives to avoid obvious injustices that might bring the entire system into disrepute. This discretionary power meant ordeals were less mechanistic than they appeared, more mediated by human judgment disguised as divine revelation. You think about that woman with her infected hand, now branded guilty by God and facing whatever punishment the court assigned, probably hanging for theft, given medieval severity. Did she actually steal? Possibly. Did her infected hand prove divine judgment? That's where your medieval worldview and modern skepticism clash irreconcilably. You want to believe in a cosmos that reveals truth through physical signs, that protects innocence through miraculous intervention. You also suspect that her hand got infected because nobody washed the iron properly and the bandages trapped bacteria for 3 days in warm, moist conditions perfect for microbial growth. The Catholic Church eventually banned trial by ordeal in 1215 through the Fourth Lateran Council, declaring that priests could no longer participate in procedures that tested God, essentially admitting the whole system was theologically questionable. Secular authorities struggled to replace it with alternatives, and gradually developed jury trials, witness testimony protocols, and evidence-based procedures that we'd recognize as ancestral to modern justice. But for centuries, ordeal served a function. It provided definitive answers when human knowledge couldn't. It leveraged religious belief to extract confessions, and it created public ceremonies that demonstrated justice was being served, however mysteriously. Tonight, in the tavern, the debate continues. Some argue ordeal is God's perfect tool for revealing truth that humans cannot discern. Others mutter that it's pure chance dressed in priestly ceremony. You stay silent, nursing your ale, flexing your bandaged arm gently. Your wound from yesterday's bloodletting is healing cleanly. You check this morning, and there's no redness, no swelling, no heat. Does that mean you're innocent of some unnamed crime? Or does it just mean Hugh the barber surgeon wiped his lancet with wine and wrapped your arm in clean linen? The answer probably depends on whether you're asking a medieval theologian or a modern doctor. And in your world, straddling both mindsets, the ambiguity remains unresolved. You're walking home from the tavern, still pondering divine judgment and infected wounds, when you hear a shout from above. "Gardyloo!" You leap backward instinctively, pressing yourself against the nearest wall, just as a cascade of brownish liquid splashes onto the cobblestones exactly where you'd been standing. The stench hits you immediately. Human waste, chamber pot contents, dumped from a second-story window into the street below. Your heart pounds from the close call. Another second, and you'd be soaked in excrement, your clothes ruined, your dignity destroyed, possibly your health compromised. The woman who dumped it leans from her window, sees you pressed against the wall, and calls down, "Sorry, love, thought the street was clear." You wave acknowledgement, too relieved to be angry, and continue homeward more carefully, watching the windows above as much as the path ahead. The Gardyloo warning, a corruption of the French garde l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, was legally required in most medieval towns before dumping chamber pot contents into streets. It seems like the barest minimum of courtesy, a pathetically inadequate solution to a disgusting sanitation problem. And it was. But it was also the law, enforced with fines and public shaming. Because without it, urban life became exponentially more dangerous and unpleasant than it already was. The chamber pot warning rule existed because medieval cities had virtually no sewage infrastructure, because indoor plumbing was centuries away, and because human waste had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was usually the street. Let's be clear about the scale of this problem. Every household generated chamber pot waste daily, usually multiple pots worth if the family was large. You couldn't exactly store it indefinitely in your small dwelling, and carrying it long distances to disposal sites was impractical, time-consuming, and frankly disgusting. So people did what seemed most efficient. They opened their windows and dumped it into the street, preferably at night when fewer pedestrians were about, hoping rain would eventually wash it away, or pigs and dogs would consume some of it, or it would simply sink into the earth and disappear through some mysterious process nobody quite understood. The problem was that streets weren't empty, even at night. The night watch patrolled. Late workers travelled home, drunks stumbled between taverns, and increasingly, as cities grew, the streets themselves became dangerous obstacle courses of slippery waste, creating fall hazards that could cause serious injury. An elderly person slipping in chamber pot contents and breaking a hip could die from complications in an era without modern medicine. A nobleman soaked in excrement might demand legal satisfaction from whoever dumped it, potentially triggering conflicts that escalated far beyond the initial humiliation. So town councils across Europe enacted chamber pot warning laws. The requirements were surprisingly specific. You had to shout a warning. Gardyloo in Scotland and northern England, Gare l'eau in France, various regional equivalents elsewhere, loudly enough to be heard on the street below. You had to wait a reasonable period, usually counted as 3 breaths or time to say a paternoster, to allow pedestrians to clear the area. You were prohibited from dumping during certain hours, usually early morning when market activity was heaviest. Violations brought fines, and repeat offenders could face progressively harsher penalties, including having their chamber pots confiscated or being required to personally clean the street they'd fouled. Enforcement was spotty and relied heavily on victims reporting violations. If you got soaked because someone dumped without warning, you could bring charges before the town court, and if witnesses confirmed the dumper's negligence, you'd receive compensation, usually monetary, and the dumper would be fined. The system worked better in neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone, where reputation mattered, and where social pressure enforced compliance more effectively than official penalties. In crowded, transient districts where anonymity prevailed, the rules were routinely ignored, and streets became cesspits. Historians still argue whether these warning laws were genuinely about public health or more about protecting elite sensibilities. Wealthy merchants and nobility who travelled urban streets in fine clothing were disproportionately harmed by waste dumping incidents, both materially, ruined expensive garments, and socially, the humiliation of appearing in public soaked in excrement. Meanwhile, poor residents who couldn't afford multiple sets of clothing and worked in already filthy conditions faced less relative harm from the same incident. The laws might have protected everyone in theory, but served elite interests most effectively in practice. There was also a disease dimension that medieval people dimly understood. They noticed that areas with heavy waste accumulation experienced higher rates of illness, though they attributed this to bad air or miasma rather than understanding germ theory. The warnings didn't prevent waste from entering streets, but they did encourage people to dump in specific locations, usually gutters or designated spots, rather than randomly across walkways. This created predictable contamination zones that people could avoid, marginally reducing disease transmission, even if nobody understood the actual mechanism. You navigate the remaining distance home, carefully avoiding the central channel where most waste accumulates and where tonight's rain will hopefully wash some of it toward the river. You pass a constable who's noting something in a ledger, probably recording a complaint about illegal dumping, and you're reminded that this disgusting, degrading aspect of urban life is at least somewhat regulated, somewhat controlled, somewhat less awful than it would be without any rules at all. The truly wealthy had better options. Grand houses had garderobes, indoor toilets that dropped waste through shafts into cesspits below, or employed servants who carried chamber pots to designated disposal areas. Monasteries and castles sometimes had sophisticated waste management systems with drainage channels and periodic cesspit emptying. But for ordinary urban residents like you, the nightly chamber pot dump was unavoidable reality, and the warning shout was the thin thread of civility preventing complete chaos. Do you remember the free-roaming pigs from earlier? Here's where they connect. Pigs consumed some of the waste in streets, making the sanitation problem marginally less catastrophic. The push to ban urban pigs thus created waste management challenges that made the chamber pot problem worse. Medieval life was full of these interconnected trade-offs, where solving one problem exacerbated another, and the best you could hope for was choosing which set of problems you'd rather live with. You reach your door and step carefully over the threshold, grateful to be inside, away from the hazards above and below. Tomorrow morning you'll empty your own chamber pot, and you'll shout the warning properly because you're not a barbarian, because you'd want the same courtesy, and because the fine for negligent dumping would hurt your finances. It's a small gesture of civilization in a world that often feels barely civilized at all. But it's something. Tonight, it's enough. You're at the bakehouse again the next morning, your arm healing nicely now, the bandage removed, when Geoffrey's wife arrives carrying bread for the midday meal. She stops at the threshold, calls to Geoffrey, and waits for him to come take the basket from her. She doesn't enter. She never enters during work hours. And you know why? She's currently menstruating, and local custom holds that a menstruating woman near the brewing vats or rising bread dough will spoil the fermentation. It's not just Geoffrey's personal superstition, it's codified in various guild regulations and brewing manuals across medieval Europe. Women are banned from breweries, bakeries, and fermentation-related work during their menstrual periods because of widespread belief that their bodies emit some quality or essence that disrupts the delicate chemistry of yeast and bacteria. It sounds like pure misogynistic nonsense, and in many ways it is. But trace the belief to its origins, and you'll find a tangled knot of observation, misunderstanding, and genuine concern for product quality that reveals how medieval people tried to explain phenomena they couldn't scientifically understand. The belief that menstruation affected fermentation appears in texts dating back to Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, who claimed that menstruating women could sour wine, kill crops, and even dull steel. Medieval Christian theology added layers of ritual impurity borrowed from Old Testament Levitical law, declaring menstruating women spiritually unclean and therefore unsuitable for handling sacred or quasi-sacred processes, and fermentation, which transformed base materials into nourishing food and drink, carried almost magical significance in medieval thought. Brewing and baking weren't just cooking, they were acts of transformation that bordered on alchemy, requiring proper conditions and properly pure participants. Here's where it gets complicated. Fermentation actually is temperamental and can be disrupted by environmental factors that medieval people couldn't measure or control. Temperature fluctuations, bacterial contamination, wild yeast strains, pH changes, all of these could cause batches to fail, and brewers and bakers developed elaborate rituals and superstitions trying to maintain consistency. They noticed patterns. Batches failed more often in summer, actually due to heat. During stormy weather, barometric pressure changes, when certain people were present, probably coincidence, or those people introduced contaminants through poor hygiene. They built explanatory frameworks connecting these observations to beliefs about purity, divine favor, and bodily essences. The menstruation ban fit this framework. If a batch failed when a particular woman was present, and if that woman was menstruating, the connection seemed obvious. Menstruation was already associated with pollution and danger in medieval theology. Women were prohibited from taking communion, entering certain parts of churches, and participating in various rituals during their periods. Extending that prohibition to fermentation work seemed logical and consistent. The fact that many batches also failed when menstruating women weren't present was conveniently forgotten or attributed to other factors. Modern feminist historians have thoroughly demolished the scientific basis for these beliefs while noting their powerful social consequences. The menstruation ban effectively barred women from certain lucrative trades for 1 week in every 4, reducing their earning potential and economic independence. It reinforced ideas of female pollution and inferiority. It gave male guild members grounds to exclude female competitors. The rule was patriarchy disguised as quality control, using pseudoscience to justify economic discrimination. Yet historians still argue about whether medieval people genuinely believed in menstrual contamination or cynically used it as an excuse. Some evidence suggests true belief. Both male and female brewers report following the prohibition, women sometimes voluntarily abstained from brewery work during menstruation, and regulations applied even to women working alone who'd have no external enforcement. Other evidence suggests pragmatic exploitation. The rules were applied inconsistently. Wealthy women could sometimes buy exemptions or hire substitutes, and women in rural areas, where labor was scarce, often ignored the prohibition without consequence. You watch Geoffrey take the basket from his wife, thanking her with obvious affection and respect. Their relationship seems genuinely equal in most respects. She manages household finances, makes business decisions, owns property in her own name. But this 1 week per month, she's banned from the bakehouse, treated as a contamination risk, excluded from work she's fully capable of performing. The contradiction is jarring, but utterly normal in medieval life, where progressive and regressive attitudes coexist without apparent cognitive dissonance. The brewing industry was actually dominated by women, alewives, for most of the medieval period, which makes the menstruation prohibition even more ironic. Women did the vast majority of England's brewing, producing ale in their homes as primary or supplementary income. They managed complex fermentation processes, maintained yeast cultures, innovated recipes, and built thriving businesses. But every month, for about a week, they had to stop work or face accusations of sabotaging their own product. Some historians suggest this periodic interruption contributed to male takeover of brewing in later centuries. Men's ability to work continuously gave them competitive advantage that eventually transformed brewing from female-dominated cottage industry to male-dominated commercial enterprise. There's also a hygiene dimension that occasionally gets lost in discussions focused purely on superstition. Medieval sanitary product technology was primitive. Rags that were washed and reused, absorbent materials that weren't always fully effective. A menstruating woman might inadvertently introduce blood contamination to workspaces, which could indeed affect product quality, though not through mystical pollution, through simple bacterial contamination. The prohibition might have originated partly from observed correlations between menstruation and contamination events, with the causal mechanism misunderstood, but the practical correlation real. Geoffrey returns to work, and you both continue in comfortable silence, hands moving through practiced motions. You think about his wife waiting outside, perfectly capable of helping but forbidden by rules that blend theology, superstition, economic competition, and misunderstood chemistry into an exclusionary barrier that nobody seriously questions. It's unjust and irrational, yet challenging it directly would brand you as dangerous, heretical, possibly insane. Medieval people could recognize specific injustices, but lacked frameworks to critique the entire system of beliefs that produced those injustices. By midday, the bread is baked, cooled, and ready for sale. Geoffrey's wife returns, her contamination period apparently considered safely past, and helps display loaves for customers. She handles the bread now without concern, sells it, takes payment, jokes with regulars. The morning's prohibition is forgotten, unremarked, normalized. Tomorrow she might be banned again, or she might work freely, depending on her body's cycle and the arbitrary rules that control it. And life continues, unjust and practical, superstitious and functional, backward and surprisingly sophisticated, all at once. That's medieval existence in a nutshell. Contradictions layered on contradictions all the way down. You're walking through the forest on Sunday afternoon, archery practice finished, your obligations met, when you spot a deer moving through the underbrush about 50 yards distant. It's a magnificent animal, a stag with impressive antlers, and your first instinct is practical hunger. That's meat, enough to feed your family for a week, maybe longer if you salt it properly. Your hand moves toward the knife at your belt before your brain catches up with what you're contemplating. Then reality crashes down like a collapsing wall. That deer belongs to the king. This entire forest, every tree and stream and living creature within it, falls under forest law, and hunting that stag would be poaching punishable by mutilation, blinding, or death, depending on which century's version of forest law applies, and how merciful the judge feels. You freeze, hand still on your knife, watching the deer watch you, and then it bounds away into deeper woods where you absolutely cannot follow. You exhale shakily and turn back toward the village, your brief fantasy of venison stew replaced by the grim knowledge that you just avoided catastrophe. Forest law was among the most hated regulations in medieval England, a system of rules that reserved vast territories, perhaps 1/3 of England at its peak, exclusively for royal hunting and timber rights. These weren't just wild, uninhabited woodlands. They included villages, farms, pastures, and common lands that people had used for generations. Suddenly, under William the Conqueror and his successors, those lands became royal forests where traditional activities became crimes. You couldn't hunt deer, boar, or other beasts of the forest. You couldn't take wood beyond carefully regulated amounts. You couldn't clear land for farming, graze animals freely, or gather certain resources without permission and payment. Violation brought savage punishment, designed to terrorize the peasantry into compliance. Why did kings impose such draconian restrictions? The surface explanation was simple. They loved hunting, Medieval nobility were obsessed with hunting as both sport and status display. Vast game parks full of deer, boar, and other prey were necessary for royal recreation and for hosting important guests in impressive hunts that demonstrated wealth and power. But the deeper economic reasons were equally important. Forests provided timber for shipbuilding, construction, and fuel, strategic resources that kingdoms needed to control. Preserving game populations meant maintaining the ecosystems that produced that timber. Clear-cutting for agriculture would destroy both game and trees, so forest law protected interconnected resources by forbidding all exploitation without royal license. The punishments for poaching were deliberately terrorizing. Early Norman forest law prescribed blinding and castration for killing deer, penalties so harsh they shocked even medieval sensibilities accustomed to brutal justice. Later versions reduced punishments to heavy fines, imprisonment, or mutilation of hands rather than genitals, but the severity remained extreme relative to other property crimes. The disproportion was intentional. Kings wanted people so terrified of poaching consequences that they wouldn't even consider it. A peasant family might be starving while deer grazed nearby, but fear of blinding kept them from hunting. The enforcement system was equally oppressive. Royal foresters, appointed officials who patrolled forest boundaries, had enormous power to arrest, fine, and punish suspected poachers. They could enter homes without warning, confiscate hunting equipment, and drag accused poachers before special forest courts that operated outside normal legal channels. These courts met regularly in forest territories, and their proceedings heavily favoured the crown. Accused poachers faced judges who benefited financially from convictions through fines and confiscated property. The system was designed to generate revenue as much as to protect game, turning forest law into a profit engine for royal treasuries. Historians still argue about how rigorously forest law was actually enforced versus how much it existed as intimidating threat. Court records show thousands of poaching prosecutions, suggesting significant enforcement effort. But they also show that many accused poachers paid fines and went free rather than suffering mutilation or death, suggesting the system prioritized revenue over terror by the 13th and 14th centuries. Regional variation was enormous. Forests near royal residences faced intense policing, while remote forests saw sporadic enforcement. Wealthy poachers could often buy pardons or claim hunting rights through noble connections, while poor poachers bore the full weight of punishment. The game preservation logic did work in its own terms. England maintained viable deer populations through the medieval period, providing consistent hunting for nobility, while contemporary regions with less restrictive laws saw game populations collapse. Forest law also preserved old-growth timber stands that supplied shipbuilding and construction needs. The environmental protection came at enormous human cost, peasants dispossessed of traditional rights, families facing starvation while surrounded by forbidden food. But it achieved its stated conservation goals more successfully than alternative approaches. Common people developed elaborate poaching techniques designed to minimize detection risk. Nighttime hunts using dogs trained to kill silently, disguised snares that looked like natural vegetation, coordinated group hunts where multiple participants shared risk and rewards, bribing or threatening foresters to ignore evidence. The cat-and-mouse game between poachers and enforcers created its own folklore. Robin Hood legends celebrating noble outlaws who defied forest law became wildly popular precisely because they expressed common people's resentment of regulations that protected aristocratic pleasures at peasant expense. You walk back toward the village and you notice how carefully you stay on the marked path, how you avoid even gathering fallen branches that might technically violate wood-taking restrictions, how thoroughly forest law has trained you to police your own behavior. That's its ultimate success. You've internalized the restrictions so completely that you don't need a forester watching to keep you compliant. The law exists inside your head now, generating fear and obedience automatically. There's a broader pattern here that connects to everything you've experienced. Medieval rules that seem arbitrary or cruel usually served specific functions for those who made them. Curfews prevented fires. Sumptuary laws maintained social order. Sanctuary interrupted blood feuds. And forest law preserved strategic resources while providing elite recreation. The rules protected some people's interests while crushing others, maintained systems that benefited those in power while oppressing those without it. Understanding the reasons doesn't make the injustices acceptable, but it reveals that medieval people weren't randomly cruel. They were strategically cruel, deliberately constructing legal systems that advanced specific goals. You reach the village boundary, where forest technically ends and common land begins, though the legal distinctions are murky and dangerous. You breathe a bit easier. That deer is still out there, still alive, still the king's property. You're still here, unblinded, unpunished, still able to feed your family through legitimate labor, even if venison remains a forbidden dream. Tomorrow you'll return to the bakehouse, to your routine of flour and fire and careful compliance with all the many rules that structure your existence. The deer will wander the forest, protected by savage law and royal privilege, and you'll eat bread and turnips and occasionally salt pork, and life will continue in its constrained, carefully regulated patterns. But tonight, just for a moment, you let yourself imagine living in a world where seeing a deer meant food rather than terror, where forests belonged to everyone rather than to crowned heads, where rules served community needs rather than elite pleasures. It's a dangerous thought, the kind that could brand you as rebellious if spoken aloud. So you keep it private, locked behind your teeth, a small act of mental resistance that changes nothing but preserves your dignity. And then you let it go, because dwelling on impossible alternatives is its own kind of suffering, and you have enough real suffering to manage without adding imaginary grief. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the evening curfew bell will ring soon. Time to head home, bank the fire, secure the shutters, settle into another night of medieval existence with all its strange rules and stranger reasons. You've survived another day. That's the real victory. Not changing the system, not escaping the restrictions, just navigating them successfully and living to face tomorrow's particular challenges. It's not the heroic life ballads celebrate, but it's the life you have, and you've learned to find small satisfactions within its narrow boundaries. The night deepens around you as you walk the final stretch home, and the familiar landmarks of your village materialize through the gathering dusk, the church spire pointing toward heaven, the bakehouse where tomorrow's bread will rise, the tavern where neighbors gather, the narrow houses pressed together like tired friends leaning on each other for support. This is your world, constrained and regulated, unjust and functional, brutal and surprisingly humane all at the same time. Every strange rule you've encountered, from curfew bells to rainbow prohibitions, from archery practice to chamber pot warnings, has served purposes you now understand, even when you don't agree with them. The medieval world wasn't primitive or ignorant. It was complex, sophisticated in its own terms, and deeply concerned with creating order from chaos, safety from danger, and survival from constant threat. The rules that governed your life were attempts, imperfect, often cruel, sometimes surprisingly clever, to solve problems that would challenge any society. How to prevent fires in wooden cities, how to maintain military readiness, how to ensure food safety, how to resolve conflicts without endless violence, how to manage resources fairly, or at least predictably. And as you push open your door and step into the warmth of your small home, as you settle by the banked fire and feel the day's exhaustion finally claim you, you realize that understanding these rules has given you a strange kind of peace, not acceptance of injustice, but recognition that your ancestors weren't fools. They were people trying their best with the knowledge they had, building systems that sometimes worked and sometimes failed, but always reflected genuine attempts to make life more livable, more safe, more predictable in a world that offered none of those things naturally. The strange rules made sense. Not perfect sense, not always moral sense, but sense nonetheless. And that understanding, however unsettling, however complicated, is perhaps the most important lesson of all, that humans throughout history have struggled with the same fundamental challenges of creating order, ensuring justice, and protecting community, even when their solutions look bizarre or backward from your modern perspective. They were doing their best, just as you are, just as everyone always has, building imperfect systems in imperfect times, hoping somehow to make tomorrow slightly better, slightly safer, slightly more just than today. And sometimes, surprisingly often really, succeeding just enough to keep going, which is all any society can truly hope for. Sleep now. Let these strange medieval rules fade into dreams. Tomorrow brings its own challenges, its own rules, its own reasons. But tonight you understand a little more about why people do what they do, why societies build the structures they build, and why even the strangest customs usually hide practical wisdom beneath their peculiar surfaces. Rest easy. You've earned it. Sweet dreams, 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 sweet dreams.